Not every president makes a mistake that changes history. These 11 did, and the country is still living with the consequences.
Number 11. Harry Truman. Let's start with the most debated one on this list. In August 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, before Japan had time to fully respond, Truman ordered a second bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Historians still argue about whether the first bomb was necessary to end the war, but the second one, dropped before diplomatic channels had even been exhausted, is where the real controversy sits. Roughly 40,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more died slowly over years from radiation. Truman never publicly expressed regret, but the speed of that second decision is still studied today as a case of momentum overtaking judgment. A decision made because the bomb existed and the plan was already moving, not because the moment demanded it.
Number 10. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is on the $20 bill. He's also responsible for one of the most devastating acts of forced displacement in American history. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the government to forcibly relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast to territory west of the Mississippi. The result was the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and other native peoples died from exposure, disease, and starvation during forced marches that, in some cases, stretched over 1,000 miles. Jackson ignored a Supreme Court ruling that the removal was unconstitutional. He pushed it through anyway. It's one of the few presidential mistakes that isn't really debated by historians at all. It's simply remembered as a tragedy.
Number 9. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson helped design the post-war order after World War I. Then he refused to let the United States be part of it. Wilson spearheaded the creation of the League of Nations, an international body meant to prevent future wars through diplomacy and collective security. It was, by most accounts, his signature achievement. But back home, he refused to negotiate with the Senate over the treaty's terms. Out of stubbornness, and after a debilitating stroke left him unable to effectively campaign for it, the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty. America never joined the league it had helped invent. Many historians argue that a weaker league, without American involvement, was less equipped to contain the very forces that led to World War II decades later.
Number 8. Herbert Hoover. When the stock market crashed in 1929, Herbert Hoover believed the economy would correct itself. It didn't. Hoover was reluctant to use the full power of the federal government to intervene. He favored voluntary cooperation from businesses and limited relief efforts, worried that direct government aid would create dependency. While he wasn't entirely passive, he did push some public works projects. His response was widely seen as too slow and too cautious for the scale of the crisis. By 1932, unemployment had soared past 20%. Hoover lost re-election in a landslide to Franklin Roosevelt, who would go on to expand the federal government's role in the economy permanently. Hoover's name became shorthand for inaction in a crisis. Hoovervilles were the shantytowns that homeless families built during his presidency.
Number 7. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson took over after Lincoln's assassination and proceeded to undo much of what the Civil War had just been fought for. Johnson was lenient toward the defeated South, pardoning former Confederate leaders and opposing civil rights protections for newly freed Black Americans. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. Congress overrode his vetoes repeatedly. He was eventually impeached, though not removed from office, for trying to fire his Secretary of War without Senate approval. The bigger mistake, historians argue, wasn't the impeachment fight. It was the years of lost opportunity. Johnson's leniency let white supremacist power structures rebuild across the South almost immediately, setting the stage for decades of Jim Crow segregation.
Number 6. Richard Nixon. This is the scandal every other scandal gets compared to. In 1972, members of Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex to plant wiretaps and steal documents. That alone might have blown over. What turned it into a constitutional crisis was the cover-up. Nixon used the CIA and FBI to obstruct the investigation, and recorded White House tapes later proved he'd known about it from the start.
For 2 years, the country watched its president actively lie to it on television. In August 1974, facing certain impeachment, Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign. The word Watergate is now used as shorthand for political scandal in general. Gate gets attached to controversies that have nothing to do with Nixon at all, decades later.
Number 5. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon Johnson inherited a small military commitment in Vietnam. He turned it into a war that would define a generation. After a disputed naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, Johnson used the event to push Congress into giving him broad war powers. Over the next 4 years, he escalated American troop presence from the thousands to over 500,000. Privately, recordings later revealed, Johnson had serious doubts about whether the war was winnable. Publicly, he kept escalating anyway, worried about looking weak on communism. By the time he left office, over 58,000 American soldiers had died, and the war would drag on for years more under his successor. Vietnam didn't just damage Johnson's presidency, it damaged public trust in government institutions for a generation afterward.
Number 4. Jimmy Carter. In November 1979, Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. Carter spent over a year trying to negotiate their release through diplomacy and economic pressure. When that stalled, he authorized a military rescue mission in April 1980. It failed catastrophically. A helicopter and a transport plane collided in the Iranian desert before the mission even reached the hostages, killing 8 American service members and forcing the entire operation to be aborted. The hostages weren't released until the very day Carter left office, 444 days after they were taken. The crisis came to define his presidency more than almost anything else he did and contributed heavily to his landslide loss to Ronald Reagan later that year.
Number 3. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's administration secretly sold weapons to Iran, a country under a U.S. arms embargo, and used the proceeds to fund rebel fighters in Nicaragua that Congress had explicitly banned the U.S. from supporting. It's called the Iran-Contra affair, and when it became public in 1986, it triggered congressional hearings and a special investigation. Reagan claimed he didn't know the details of how the operation was run, even as top officials in his own administration were indicted. Several were later convicted of charges including lying to Congress. Whether Reagan truly didn't know or simply distanced himself once it became a liability is still debated. Either way, it remains one of the clearest examples of a White House operating completely outside the boundaries Congress had set, and getting caught.
Number 2. George W. Bush. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq based on intelligence claiming Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons were never found. The invasion toppled Saddam's government within weeks, but the Bush administration had no real plan for what came after. The power vacuum that followed fueled years of sectarian violence, an insurgency that killed thousands of American troops, and eventually created the conditions that allowed ISIS to rise nearly a decade later. The war cost well over $1 trillion and contributed to lasting instability across the region that, by many accounts, the U.S. is still untangling itself from today. It's frequently ranked by historians and foreign policy analysts as one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of the last 50 years, not because of what it intended to do, but because of what it triggered afterward.
Number 1. James Buchanan. And the biggest mistake of them all might be the one where a president did almost nothing at all. By the time James Buchanan took office in 1857, the country was already splitting apart over slavery. Over the next 4 years, Buchanan had the chance to act. He chose not to. When South Carolina seceded in December 1860, followed quickly by 6 more states, Buchanan insisted secession was illegal, but also insisted he had no constitutional power to stop it. So he did nothing. No troops, no negotiation, no real action of any kind. For the final months of his term, Buchanan effectively watched the country dissolve in real time, then handed an already fractured nation to Abraham Lincoln on Inauguration Day. Historians consistently rank him as one of the worst presidents in American history, not for a single dramatic failure, but for an entire presidency built on looking away at the exact moment the country needed someone to act.
11 presidents, 11 decisions that didn't just fail in the moment, They reshaped the decades that followed. Which one do you think did the most lasting damage? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the moments that defined American history, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.